Most of these crockpot recipes were never written down, yet they fed American families for decades. This video opens a forgotten chapter of home cooking, pulling 10 slow-cooked meals straight from the kind of cookbook that lived in a grandmother's memory, not on a shelf. Each recipe reflects a time when patience mattered, ingredients were stretched with care, and dinner carried responsibility, not convenience. These were meals trusted to simmer while work was done, children were raised, and days moved slowly. Some of these dishes would surprise modern kitchens, yet they once kept households steady through long winters, factory shifts, and tight budgets. As this list unfolds, you will hear where these recipes came from, why families depended on them, and how they quietly shaped everyday American life. Watch closely because by the final recipe, you will understand why these meals disappeared and why remembering them now matters more than ever. Before meal prep had a name, this beef stew quietly worked all day on kitchen counters across America. It was a recipe built for trust. Once the lid went on, there was no stirring, no checking, and no rushing. Families relied on it to be ready when they were. This stew became popular in the 1960s and 1970s, when crockpots entered working households. Tough cuts of beef were chosen on purpose. Chuck roast or stew meat simmered slowly until it softened, proving that patience could turn inexpensive ingredients into something rich and dependable. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and celery were added without measuring, often cut large so they could hold their shape through long hours of heat. The seasoning was simple. Salt, black pepper, and a bay leaf were usually enough. Some kitchens added a spoon of tomato paste or a splash of beef broth saved from earlier meals. Nothing fancy belonged here. The crockpot was meant to cook quietly while laundry was folded, children were picked up, or shifts ended late. What made this stew special was timing, not technique. It cooked while life happened. By evening, the house smelled warm and steady, like something had been taken care of. Bread was sliced thick. Bowls were filled generously. There were no sides needed because this was the meal. For many families, this stew meant security. It meant dinner would be ready no matter how hard the day became. It stretched meat, filled stomachs, and made leftovers that tasted even better the next day. This was not a recipe meant to impress guests. It was meant to keep a family moving forward. And that is why it earned its place at the top of Grandma's lost crockpot cookbook. Crockpot chicken and dumplings was not born from comfort. It was born from necessity. When time was short and money was tighter, this dish offered warmth, fullness, and reliability in a single pot. Families trusted it because it required very little attention yet delivered a meal that felt complete. This recipe gained ground in the 1970s as more homes relied on slow cookers to manage long workdays. A whole chicken or bone in pieces were placed directly into the crockpot, often without trimming. The bones mattered. They created a rich broth that could not be rushed. Onions, carrots, and celery were added for flavor, not decoration. Seasoning stayed restrained. Salt, black pepper, and sometimes poultry seasoning were enough. The lid stayed closed for hours, allowing the chicken to break down until it could be pulled apart with a spoon. Nothing about this process was quick, and that was the point. The dumplings came last. Dough was mixed simply with flour, baking powder, salt, and milk. Small spoonfuls were dropped into the bubbling broth near the end of cooking. As the lid went back on, the dumplings steamed gently, swelling into soft, comforting pillows that absorbed the flavor of the chicken. This meal mattered because it fed many people from very little. One chicken could stretch across several bowls. Leftovers thickened overnight and tasted even better the next day. Crockpot chicken and dumplings was not served for praise. It was served because it worked. It filled kitchens with steam, warm, tired hands, and reminded families that something steady was waiting for them at home. This recipe belonged to households that knew how to wait. Crockpot pinto beans with ham was not rushed, measured, or dressed up. It was a quiet meal that cooked all day, asking only for time and trust in return. Dried pinto beans were chosen because they were cheap, filling, and dependable. They were rinsed, sometimes soaked overnight, then poured straight into the crockpot. A leftover ham bone or a small piece of salt pork was added, not for size but for flavor. That single piece carried the entire pot. This dish was common in rural kitchens and working-class homes throughout the mid-20th century. It fit families who left early and returned late, knowing dinner would be ready without effort. Onion and garlic were added if they were on hand. If not, the beans still worked. Seasoning stayed minimal. Too much would ruin the balance. Salt often waited until the end, after the ham had given everything it could. As the hours passed, the beans softened and the broth thickened, turning cloudy and rich. This meal was rarely eaten alone. Cornbread sat nearby, broken by hand and dropped into bowls. Some families added sliced onions or a splash of vinegar at the table. None of it was written down. Everyone knew how it should taste. Crockpot pinto beans with ham mattered because they turned scraps into nourishment. They fed large families, stretched leftovers, and carried people through long weeks. This was slow cooking at its most honest, and that honesty is why this recipe never needed a cookbook page. Crockpot meatloaf was a quiet star of mid-century kitchens, offering families a way to stretch ground beef while keeping dinner simple. Unlike oven-baked versions, the slow cooker transformed humble ingredients into a dish that could simmer unattended, filling homes with a sense of steadiness and comfort. Ground beef was combined with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, a little milk, and an egg if it was available. Onions and seasonings were added sparingly, salt, black pepper, and sometimes a pinch of paprika. The mixture was shaped into a loaf and placed directly into the crockpot, often lined with a bit of grease or parchment to prevent sticking. This method became popular in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly for working families who returned home late from jobs or errands. While the meatloaf slowly cooked, kitchens were free for chores, children, or homework. The lid stayed closed, preserving heat and letting flavors develop without interruption. Near the end of cooking, a simple glaze of ketchup or tomato paste was spread across the top. It caramelized gently from the retained heat, creating a shiny, slightly tangy crust. The aroma filled the home, signaling that a familiar, reliable meal awaited. Crockpot meatloaf was more than convenience. It represented consistency. Families could count on it for dinner, stretch portions to feed more mouths, and enjoy leftovers that often tasted better the next day. This slow-cooked meatloaf was never about impressing guests. It existed to feed families, nurture them, and provide reassurance that a meal was ready at the end of a long day. Its presence in Grandma's lost cookbook reminds us that simple, dependable recipes shaped the way Americans cooked, ate, and remembered home. Crockpot corned beef and cabbage was a dish that demanded patience but rewarded families with warmth and nourishment. It was not a recipe of haste. It was built for homes where slow cooking meant practicality and flavor. Corned beef brisket, often purchased on sale, was placed in the crockpot with water or a light broth. Bay leaves, black peppercorns, and occasionally mustard seeds were added for subtle seasoning. The meat needed hours to soften, allowing the tough fibers to break down and release a rich, savory aroma throughout the kitchen. Cabbage, carrots, and potatoes were added midway through the cooking process so they retained texture without overcooking. This layering reflected the care families took, even when pressed for time. Each vegetable contributed to a balanced meal, stretching the corned beef further while absorbing the flavorful broth. This dish was especially common in working-class homes during the 1960s and 1970s, often prepared for Sunday dinners or special occasions. While the crockpot did its work, families attended to chores, children, or social visits, trusting that a hearty, satisfying meal awaited them. What made this recipe stand out was its accessibility. Corned beef could be bought cheaply, cabbage was plentiful, and the crockpot allowed hands-off preparation. Leftovers became sandwiches or hash the next day, ensuring nothing was wasted. Crockpot corned beef and cabbage was more than a dinner. It was a practice of care, economy, and patience. It held families together, filled plates steadily, and remains a testament to how slow cooking once shaped everyday American life. Crockpot baked beans with molasses was a recipe rooted in tradition, designed to nourish families while requiring minimal attention. It was slow, sweet, and deeply comforting, exactly what kitchens needed during long workdays. Dried navy or small white beans were soaked overnight when possible, then added to the crockpot with water, salt pork, or a ham hock. Molasses provided sweetness, but only enough to enhance the beans without overwhelming them. Onion and a dash of mustard or black pepper completed the simple seasoning, creating a rich, mellow flavor that developed over hours of gentle heat. This recipe was common in the 1950s through the 1970s, appearing on tables where efficiency mattered as much as taste. Families could start the beans in the morning and return to a thick, hearty meal by evening. No stirring was required. The slow cooker did the work while life continued around it. The magic of this dish was how inexpensive ingredients became something special. Beans stretched meals across many bowls, salt pork added depth without excess, and molasses brought a touch of sweetness reminiscent of home. Served with cornbread or leftover biscuits, it satisfied hunger and created a sense of routine and comfort. Crockpot baked beans with molasses was not just food, it was history in a pot. It reflected the ingenuity of households that relied on modest resources to feed families reliably. Even today, tasting this recipe offers a direct link to kitchens that valued patience, practicality, and the quiet satisfaction of a well-cooked meal. Crockpot Salisbury steak was a mid-century innovation, transforming ground beef into a meal that required little effort but delivered consistent flavor. It became a staple in homes where convenience met care, and slow cooking turned simple ingredients into something hearty and dependable. Ground beef was combined with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, a touch of milk, and an egg when available. Salt, black pepper, and occasionally onion powder were added, keeping the seasoning simple and classic. The mixture was formed into oval patties and placed carefully in the crockpot, often layered to fit the pot without crowding. Gravy was made in the same vessel. Onions, beef broth, and sometimes a small splash of Worcestershire sauce or ketchup were poured over the patties. The crockpot allowed the sauce to thicken slowly, infusing the meat with rich, savory flavor while creating a comforting aroma that filled the home. This recipe rose in popularity during the 1960s and 1970s, especially in working households. It was reliable. While the patties cooked, families could finish chores, pick up children, or complete evening routines without worrying about dinner timing. By the time the lid was lifted, the dish was tender, flavorful, and ready to serve. Salisbury steak in the crockpot mattered because it stretched inexpensive meat, provided a complete meal, and gave leftovers that could feed another day. It reflected the ingenuity of families who valued practicality without sacrificing taste. This dish is a reminder that slow cooking was not just about convenience, it was about preserving flavor, time, and care. Crockpot Salisbury steak may have faded from modern menus, but it holds a place in the memory of kitchens that knew how to turn modest ingredients into meals that nourished both body and home. Crockpot pot roast with root vegetables was a cornerstone of mid-century home cooking, offering families a meal that was both filling and forgiving. Tough cuts of beef, once considered too inexpensive for special dinners, transformed into tender, flavorful meals after hours of slow cooking. A chuck roast or similar cut was placed in the crockpot, often seared briefly beforehand but sometimes left raw. Carrots, Potatoes and onions were added around the meat, absorbing its juices as the roast slowly broke down. Celery, garlic, and bay leaves provided subtle flavor, keeping seasoning simple and approachable. This dish became widespread in the 1960s and 1970s, when crockpots allowed working families to prepare a full dinner without constant attention. While the roast simmered, homes remained busy with chores, homework, or errands, trusting that the meal would be ready by evening. Gravy formed naturally in the pot as the meat released its juices. Some families thickened it with a spoonful of flour or cornstarch, but most relied on the natural richness to coat slices of beef and vegetables. Bread or biscuits accompanied the plate, making every meal hearty and complete. Crockpot pot roast mattered because it turned modest ingredients into sustenance that fed many. Leftovers became sandwiches, soups, or stews for the following days. It was more than a meal. It was reliability, comfort, and patience rewarded with flavor. This recipe exemplifies how slow cooking shaped everyday American kitchens. It demanded little effort, stretched ingredients, and provided warmth, both literal and emotional, reminding families why certain dishes were trusted generation after generation.